6 months and more since the launching of the Israeli genocide in Gaza, it's becoming increasingly clear that the capitalist imperialist system is plunging headlong into World War III, a war which threatens the very existence of mankind. The crucial question of the hour, therefore, is how is this looming catastrophe to be prevented? What is to be done? It's already been made apparent that protests to Israel and the imperialist powers, no matter how angry, no matter how powerful, no matter what their size, and millions have taken part in the world over, are not going to bring about a change of course. On the contrary, the more the protests have grown, the more the onslaught has intensified, while at the same time, capitalist governments around the world have responded, as we see in the United States, with deep-going assaults on basic democratic rights under the big lie worthy of Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, that opposition to genocide is anti-Semitic. Now, this situation requires that we probe deeper, driven by an understanding that the answer to the question of what way forward can only be found by laying bare the fundamental driving forces at work and developing the necessary strategy and perspective to overcome them. And this necessitates a struggle to expose the role of the pseudo-left organisations, in this country, Solidarity, Socialist Alternative, Socialist Alliance, and their counterparts internationally, which promote the poisonous fiction that protests must be directed to pressuring Israel and the imperialist governments backing it, including the Albanese Labor government, to change course. Now, an objective, that is scientific examination, reveals not only the bankruptcy of this perspective, but the political role that it plays in straitjacketing the anti-war movement. Now, in the New Year's statement issued by the World Socialist Web Site, it made the vital point, which I think is crucial to understanding the course of events. That statement explained the Gaza genocide could not be understood simply as a unique episode flowing from the reactionary nationalist ideology of Zionism. That, of course, played an important part. But the unrestrained ferocity of the present war, carried out with the full support of its imperialist paymasters and weapons suppliers, can be understood and explained only in the context of the breakdown of the world imperialist and nation-state system. And since these lines were written, that analysis, I think, has been confirmed in spades. The passage this week by the US Congress of a series of war bills advanced by the Biden administration, providing additional funds for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, makes clear that what is taking place in Gaza is part of an ever-expanding war front directed against Russia and China and Iran in the Middle East. Now, the breakdown of the capitalist system, of which war is the most intense expression, is present everywhere you look. The existential threat posed by climate change cannot be dealt with on a rational scientific basis because that would conflict with profit. It's manifested in the refusal by capitalist governments, as has been seen in the experience of the COVID pandemic, to implement basic public health safety measures for the same reason. The elevation to obscene levels of wealth in the hands of the corporate and financial oligarchy which dominates the world, accompanied by the development of fascist and authoritarian forms of rule and police state measures now being employed to suppress democratic rights in every country, is another expression of this fundamental breakdown. A third world war, the ultimate expression of breakdown, is no longer a possibility or a potentiality, significant as that would be. It's inevitable unless it is stopped by the political intervention of the working class, the mass of the world's people. The last war ended with the use of nuclear weapons, the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A third world war would begin with their use. US imperialism is on the rampage. With its economic power severely eroded since it undertook the reconstruction of world capitalism after 1945, it seeks to maintain its position by military means, including the use of nuclear weapons. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating, take note of the recent statements by US Michigan Republican Congressman Tim Walberg. He called for the total destruction of Gaza. I quote, "It should be like Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Get it over quick." And then, underscoring that the US-NATO war in Ukraine is aimed at crippling Russia, part of the drive by US imperialism for global dominance, he went on, "It should be the same in Ukraine, where the aim of the US should be to wipe out Russian forces." Now, please don't make the mistake of consoling yourself with the view, well, these are just the utterances of some right-wing fanatic well outside the mainstream of bourgeois politics. Because what is said today by these people becomes policy tomorrow. Leader of the British Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, next Prime Minister in line, has made clear that he's prepared to order the deaths of millions by nuclear weapons. Earlier this month, he was asked if he would press the nuclear button. He said, "The nuclear deterrent is the ultimate threat, and therefore, of course, the deterrent only works if there is a preparedness to use it." And when pressed further by the questioner who said, "Well, even if this means potentially killing millions of people," Starmer said, "The deterrent only works if there is a preparedness to use it." So that is a clear answer to your question. Now, the maniacal response is not a product of the individual psyche of Starmer or any other imperialist politician who would respond in the same way if they were asked the same question. It's an expression of the historical insanity of the capitalist nation-state and profit system, which has become a reactionary barrier to further human progress and threatens the destruction of civilization if it is not removed through World Socialist Revolution. The International Committee of the Fourth International, of which the SEP is the Australian section, of which the IYSSE is its youth movement, is the only party, bar none, which actively fights for this necessary perspective in the anti-war movement. And the ending of war by means of the struggle for socialism cannot be consigned to some far-off, distant, misty future. It must be advanced as the program of the day. How is that to be done? It necessitates a turn to the working class, the sole social force created by capitalism itself, now integrated and unified by the globalisation of production to a degree never seen in history. It's only this social force which has the power, the capacity to overturn the imperialist juggernaut. Now, as always, when a crisis takes place, a conscious understanding of what's happened always lags behind the objective situation. Thinking, you could say, is the most conservative factor in the political situation. Therefore, the crucial task in building and developing the anti-war movement is to turn to the working class through a political, theoretical, organisational struggle to imbue it with an understanding of the objective situation and what it has to do. Action depends on the clarification of the role of political tendencies, above all the pseudo-left, which seek to confine the working class to the straitjacket of the capitalist order. Protest, no matter how angry or powerful, will not change the course of the imperialist powers. Voting out one set of capitalist politicians to vote in another set or trying to choose which one of these criminals is the lesser evil is futile. The crisis is rooted in the very nature of the capitalist imperialist system itself. It can't be made to reverse course, it must be overturned. Now, the value of every crisis, and war above all else, is that it lays bare the fundamental character of all social relations, structures, and together with that, the essential character of all political tendencies which can somehow be covered over in so-called normal times. Capitalist governments around the world which profess their support for democracy and the rule of law have been revealed as criminals, supporters and advocates of genocide, the worst crime committed by the Nazi regime in the 20th century in the Holocaust. No less does this apply to the Albanese government in this country, dominated by the so-called left faction of the party. From its very beginning, Labor, which has sought to present itself as the party of the working man and woman, as representative of social progress, has always functioned as the chief prop of capitalism and necessarily in its wars. We should recall, in the wake of Anzac Day just past, that in the first manifestation of capitalist breakdown, the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the Labor leader Andrew Fisher declared that in Britain's war with Germany for markets, for profits and colonies, Australia would defend the British Empire to the last man and the last shilling. In this war, the Labor government has been among the foremost in backing the Israeli regime, not only politically, ideologically, but also with the continued supply of vital components for its war machine. And every day, Pine Gap sends out messages, the base, to US operations. Now, this is only, in fact, part of a wider agenda by the Labor government, which aligns itself directly with the drive of US imperialism to dominate the world. It fully backs the US NATO operation in the Ukraine directed against Russia and sends representatives to the war planning meetings of NATO. Labor government has placed Australia at the very forefront, in many ways the tip of the spear of the US political, economic and military encirclement of China as it prepares for war to dominate the Eurasian landmass. AUKUS is part of this. While it has not yet carried out the actions to suppress democratic rights on the scale now being taking place in the US and Germany, this won't be long in coming. No less than its counterparts, it seeks to label protesters anti-Semitic. And its immediate labelling of a knife attack on a priest by a mentally disturbed 16-year-old boy as a terrorist attack before any of the circumstances were known, thereby giving the police sweeping powers under the reactionary terror laws now exercised in raids against teenagers this week, is a warning of what is to come. At the same time, the government is preparing to bring down a budget with increased military spending to be paid for by further attacks on social services, worsening conditions for the working class, already facing the biggest reductions in real wages in the post-war period. The Labor government works hand in glove with the trade union bureaucracy, both on the domestic and the war front. The bureaucratic trade union apparatus is the chief mechanism for the suppression of the class struggle, the enforcement of cuts in living standards and real wages demanded by international banks, corporations, Australian corporations and so on, while backing increased military spending financed by cuts in social services, health and education. And it facilitates the imperialist-backed genocide by refusing to lift a finger in support of the call by the Palestinian trade unions for a ban on shipments to Israel, while various trade union officials engage in protest stunts to cover up their real role. War has no less exposed the real role of the pseudo-left forces which posture as socialist, even at times as revolutionary. They must be judged not by left phrases that they give off at certain times, but what they actually do. And what they do is to seek to straitjacket the anti-war movement, drive it into a blind alley by maintaining that the Albanese government, rooted in the deepest needs and interests of imperialism, can be pressured to change course. This is aimed at preventing those who have come forward in shock and horror from going forward. One of the most important concepts that has to be grasped to obtain a scientific understanding of politics and political struggle is that perspectives and programs are not just a set of ideas, differences of opinion, one battling against the other. No, these conflicting programs and perspectives are rooted in definite, conflicting social and class forces. So the question arises, well, what class forces are expressed in the perspective of the pseudo-left? To answer this question, let me direct your attention to a very important article written by the chairman of the World Socialist Web Site editorial board, David North, entitled After the Slaughter, Political Lessons of the Balkan War. And it dealt with the US-led NATO bombing of Serbia, which went on for 3 months in 1999. And North there pointed to a very significant development. Many of the leaders of the NATO powers carrying out the bombing had been opponents of the Vietnam War, even one-time radicals in the 60s and 70s. The political history of these individuals, North wrote, was not merely a confirmation of the French adage, before 30, a revolutionary, afterwards a swine, but typified the evolution of a broad layer in contemporary society. In the First World War, he continued, Lenin had pointed to the link between the super profits obtained by imperialism from the colonies and the political corruption of the labour bureaucracy in the imperialist countries, which led them to support the war. Now, present-day conditions, he said, were of course not analogous, but a similar process was at work. He went on. The objective modus operandi and implications of the protracted stock market boom have enabled imperialism to recruit from among sections of the upper middle class a new and devoted constituency. The pseudo-lefts are rooted in this process. It's not the place here to go into the mechanics of financialisation, the further elevation of the stock market since these lines were written, except to point out that the elevation of share values and the creation of a financial oligarchy and a privileged layer of the upper middle class depends not least on the suppression of the class struggle. One only need to ask, would Wall Street have reached record highs if America had been engulfed by class struggle as workers sought to regain what they've lost over the last 30 years? Or for that matter, where would the ASX index be in this country if the same took place? And the chief mechanism for the suppression of the working class is the trade union bureaucracy, who in fact constitute a part of this privileged upper middle class layer. They sit on company boards, they preside over vast superannuation funds, and the unions receive subsidies for their so-called training programs from employers. And the chief defenders of this parasitic caste are the pseudo-left, not least in the anti-war movement. When the SEP and the World Socialist Web Site have exposed the role of the leadership of the Maritime Union of Australia in opposing the call by Palestinian unions for the imposition of bans on Israeli shipping, the pseudo-left group Solidarity rushed to their defence, including when the union leadership, which professes opposition to genocide, invited one of its chief enablers, Prime Minister Albanese, to address their annual conference. The struggle against the pseudo-left is not some pivot, it's not some side issue, it's pivotal. It's pivotal to the clarification of the working class. And it's embodied in their history. Because whatever, as Max mentioned, whatever their differences, the various organisations of the pseudo-left have one thing in common. They all derive from tendencies which broke from the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution, founded by Leon Trotsky in 1938, grounded on the lessons of the Russian Revolution and all that followed. And that break, in whatever political form it took immediately, comprised two essential components. First, the rejection of the revolutionary role of the working class, and second, rejection of the necessity to construct a revolutionary party to raise the consciousness of that class to the level demanded by the objective situation and arm it with a program to take power as had taken place in the October 1917 Russian Revolution. Now, the role of the pseudo-left, therefore, is not some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. It's rooted in their political DNA. In founding the Fourth International, Trotsky insisted the Russian Revolution had demonstrated then and for all time the revolutionary role of the working class. That if guided and led by a revolutionary party based on Marxism, it could overthrow capitalism, take political power, defend the workers' state it had established against the attempts of imperialism to overthrow it, and establish the political foundations for socialism and the eventual transition to a classless society. The Russian Revolution was a monumental turning point in world history and remains so. And it has enormous contemporary relevance. Because as we are plunged into a new round of imperialist barbarism, we can appreciate how it was that millions of workers of earlier generations, of youth, found it necessary to storm the heavens and undergo enormous sacrifice in the struggle to overthrow capitalism. We can see why they did it. And we should recall, in the present situation, that the Russian Revolution effectively brought about the end of World War I. The imperialist powers would have continued the slaughter were it not for the fear that if they did, they would experience the same fate as their Russian counterparts. Trotsky's perspective, one of historically derived optimism, is not invalidated by the rise of the Stalinist bureaucracy in the USSR, its usurpation of political power, because this was not some inevitable product of the revolution as maintained by the bourgeoisie and its defenders. Rather, it resulted from the fact that the revolution did not extend beyond the confines of Russia. Not because revolutionary struggles failed to erupt, they did in France, in Germany, in Italy, and the fear of revolution extended to the United States, but because they were betrayed by social democracy, which had supported the war, and the young communist parties had not had sufficient time to come to the leadership of the working class in the immediate post-World War I period. So the isolation of the Soviet Union meant it faced enormous problems bequeathed by the past. Yes, the revolution could abolish private property by decree, but it could not abolish in the same way 1,000 years of economic backwardness and low cultural development. Conditions of economic scarcity, as the revolution remained isolated, gave rise to the emergence of a bureaucracy within the workers' state. It had social roots. Economic backwardness meant there were not enough resources to go around to ensure genuine equality. The bureaucracy developed as a social organ which determined who got what and how much. It became the gendarme of inequality within the workers' state. And to maintain and advance its social interests, it sought out a political representative, finding it in Stalin, and the apparatus he came to head. So it was not that Stalin created the bureaucracy. Rather, the bureaucracy selected Stalin as its leadership. Its political program was advanced in 1924 with the reactionary dogma of socialism in one country, in diametrical opposition to the perspective of world socialist revolution on which the Russian Revolution had been carried out. Now, this was not inevitable, as claimed by the opponents of revolution. There was an alternative grounded on Marxism. It was led by the left opposition, established under the leadership of Leon Trotsky in 1923. Initially developed to fight the growing power of the bureaucracy, and Lenin had him engaged in such a fight in the last days of his life. It fought in the increasingly dangerous economic policies of Stalinism within the Soviet Union, and those it pursued internationally, which led to the defeats of the working class. In the 1920s, the left opposition fought for the reform of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Communist International. But in 1933, an event took place which meant this was now impossible. This was the coming to power of Hitler and his Nazi regime, installed by the German ruling classes to crush the working class. There was nothing inevitable about Hitler's rise to power. It could have been prevented had the policies advocated by Trotsky been carried out. The formation of a united front of workers' organisations, of the Social Democrats and the Communist Party, to defeat the fascists. This was opposed by the Social Democrats, who called on the capitalist state to deal with Hitler, as that very same state was organising to bring him to power. The Communist Party opposed a united front, declaring that the SPD and its members, numbering millions of workers in the party and the unions, were social fascists. Now, this left-sounding rhetoric, which split the working class, was in fact the most abject passivity, because it was based on the conception that after Hitler had come to power, then the Communist Party said it would be our turn. Now, there was no question that had the policies advanced by Trotsky been carried out, there would have been no Hitler, no World War II, no death of millions, and no Holocaust. So it underscores that this time, as new disasters engulf the world and as fascist movements are on the rise, the analysis of the Trotskyist movement should be listened to and acted on. After the victory of Hitler, the Stalinist leadership declared the policies it had been pursued up to and including his ascension to power had been absolutely correct. No discussion was allowed. And in July 1933, Trotsky concluded the policy of trying to reform such an organisation was impossible. A party, he said, that was not aroused by the thunder of fascism was dead for the purpose of revolution. A new international had to be established, and 5 years of preparation followed, described by Trotsky as the most important of his life. In 1938, as World War II rapidly approached, Trotsky concluded that the 5 years of discussion had to come to an end. There could be no further delay. The Fourth International had to be established. The opening sentence of its program declared, "The world situation as a whole is chiefly characterised by a historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat." Now, this was not just an exhortation by Trotsky to his supporters. It was the most concise summing up of the objective situation. Capitalism and its horrors had only survived not because of some alleged incapacity of the working class to overthrow it, but because its leaderships, Stalin's, social democratic, as well as the trade unions, propped it up. From its very foundation, the Fourth International came under attack. It was held that a new international could only be founded on great events, And Trotsky replied, well, they've already taken place, the greatest betrayals of the working class in history. Shortly after its founding, the analysis of the Fourth International of the Soviet Union also came under fire. Trotsky insisted that with the usurpation of power by the Stalinist bureaucracy, the Soviet Union was a degenerated workers' state. It's not a healthy workers' state. But not everything had been destroyed. And notwithstanding the rule of Stalinism, the Soviet Union had to be defended against imperialism because the nationalised property relations established by the October Revolution remained intact. Now, the attack came from within the US Socialist Workers' Party, the largest section of the Fourth International. A faction led by Max Shachtman and James Burnham maintained the Soviet Union was no longer a workers' state in any form and could not be defended against imperialism. Stalinism, they maintained, was not a bureaucratic cancer, but represented the birth of a new class, either state capitalist or bureaucratic collectivist. It was a pro-imperialist policy. And today in this country, the state capitalist, socialist alternative and solidarity, the Socialist Workers' Party in the UK, the Democratic Socialists of America, have their origins in the pro-imperialist politics of Burnham and Shachtman. In his polemic against them, Trotsky probed the deep questions of historical perspective that were at stake here. Because to maintain that the Stalinist apparatus was a new exploiting class was a complete abandonment of scientific method and its replacement by crass impressionism. It looks like a class, so it is one. But classes, ruling classes, exploited classes alike, are formed in their relationship to the productive forces of society and its social relations. This is not just a term of abuse. The historical legitimacy of any ruling class in its ascent to power is based on its development of the productive forces in the socio-economic system over which it presides. This is the case with the bourgeoisie, which came to power in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, unleashing the development of the productive forces under capitalism. But this is not the case with the Stalinist bureaucracy in Russia. It did not bring in nationalised property relations on which it rested. That was the achievement of the working class in the October Revolution. And Trotsky went further. If the proletarian revolution had brought to power a new exploiting class, that is, if the defeats were somehow rooted in the nature of the working class itself, in its inability to advance mankind towards a classless society, then, he said, the position of modern society will have to be acknowledged as hopeless. Altogether differently, he continued, does the situation present itself to him who has clarified in his mind the profound antagonism between the organic, deep-going, insurmountable urge of the toiling masses to tear themselves free from the bloody capitalist chaos and the conservative, patriotic, utterly bourgeois character of the outlived Labor leadership. Now, the positions advanced by Burnham and Shachtman were the opening shots of what was to turn out to be a war against the Fourth International, the logic of which was to liquidate it. The situation which emerged from World War II was highly complex. The Soviet Union and its Red Army had defeated the Nazis, and the Stalinist bureaucracy extended its sphere of influence. In a deal with imperialism, Moscow was ceded control of Eastern Europe in return for the suppression of the revolutionary struggles of the working class in Western Europe, in particularly Greece, Italy and France, and in 1947 it began carrying out the overturn of capitalist property relations in areas in Eastern Europe under its control. The situation facing the Fourth International had changed. After a careful discussion, it designated these new states as deformed workers' states, with the emphasis very much on the deformed, indicating they had not been created by a proletarian revolution, but by action from above carried out by the Stalinist bureaucracy. This definition meant that on the basis of that nationalised property relations that had been established, they had to be defended against imperialism. But this new situation, however, became the starting point for the advancement of an entirely new perspective, completely at variance with the previous analysis made by the Trotskyist movement of the counter-revolutionary role of Stalinism. According to the conception advanced by the Secretary of the Fourth International, Michel Pablo, these deformed workers' states were the wave of the future. He claimed that Stalinism had a progressive role to play. In a coming war with imperialism, it was a vehicle for socialist transformation. It would be forced to extend the actions it had taken in Eastern Europe, leading to centuries of deformed workers' state. The sort of essence of what he was putting forward was summed up in a document in 1951 entitled, "Where Are We Going?" Pablo wrote, "For our movement, objective social reality consists essentially of the capitalist regime and the Stalinist world." Now, in this impressionistic outlook, there was no place for the working class as an independent force fighting against both the capitalist regime and the Stalinist bureaucracy. There was therefore no place for the Fourth International as the leadership of that struggle of the working class. And it was a liquidationist perspective which Pablo rapidly put into practice, expelling the French section because it would not dissolve itself into the French Communist Party. Now, it took some time for the full implications of the Pabloite perspective to be grasped, but when they were, the leader of the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States, James Buchanan, in November 1953, acted decisively, issuing an open letter to the World Trotskyist movement calling for a return to orthodox Trotskyism. It led to the formation of the International Committee of the Fourth International, of which the SEP and its sister sections are today the continuation. The open letter was not the end of the fight against Pabloism, only its beginning. The adaptation to Stalinism was only the initial form of the Pabloite perspective. With the rise of anti-imperialist national movements, particularly following the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which brought Castro and his petty bourgeois guerrilla movement to power and limited nationalisation of some industries, the Pabloites claimed that Cuba was a workers' state. The working class had no need to build a Bolshevik-type party as been carried out by Lenin. It could come to power with a blunted instrument, that is, with petty bourgeois national forces that had no relation to Marxism. And based on this perspective, whole sections of the Trotskyist movement were destroyed, liquidated into these petty bourgeois national movements. It did, however, prove highly attractive to sections of petty bourgeois student youth arising out of the new left in the 1960s in the advanced capitalist countries, which explicitly rejected an orientation to the working class. The origins of socialist alliance in this country lie here, peddling the illusion that petty bourgeois nationalist movements, not the struggle to politically educate the working class, was the way forward. And when the working class did erupt in revolutionary battles in May-June 1968 in France, in the general strike, when power was on the streets almost literally waiting to be picked up, the Pabloites claimed that the students and the so-called counterculture were the new vanguard. Now, anyone who considers that the disputes and conflicts within the revolutionary movement are full of sound and fury signifying nothing, should consider the fact that when a revolutionary situation arose in Chile in 1970 to 73, the reason there was no Trotskyist party to lead the working class to power and prevent the coming to power of the Pinochet dictatorship and the bloodbath which followed was because it had been liquidated on the basis of the Pabloid perspective into the petty bourgeois guerrilla movements. And at the same time, the question should be asked today, where are the Castroite, Guevarist, Maoist, national liberation movements hailed by Pabloism as the way forward, as the shortcut around the difficult struggle to build a revolutionary leadership in the working class? Where are they today? Non-existent, with numbers of their erstwhile leaders occupying positions in parties and governments carrying out the dictates of the imperialist bourgeoisie. Now, the final phase of what was a 30-year civil war inside the Trotskyist movement was entered in 1982 when David North, now chairman of the World Socialist Web Site editorial board, initiated a political struggle against the increasingly Pabloid positions being advanced by the leadership of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, the British section of the International Committee. It was no easy fight because the leaders of the WRP enjoyed tremendous political authority because of the earlier struggle they had waged under difficult conditions against Pabloid liquidationism. But this struggle was to culminate in the victory of the orthodox Trotskyists in the 1985-86 split with the WRP. The crucial component of that victory was the commitment to fight for the historically developed analysis and program forged in the struggle against Pabloism. And I venture to say that when future historians come to deal with this period, they will recognise that the advancement of mankind to socialism was dependent on the struggle waged by the ICFI to maintain and advance the continuity of Marxism, and that the struggle against Pabloism in all its forms was as critical as that waged by Lenin against the Mensheviks that prepared the way for the Russian Revolution, perhaps even more so. Reviewing the split, the ICFI grasped that its victory was an expression of profound changes in the objective situation. They were bound up with the globalisation of production, which was shattering national-based organisations and the post-war system of international relations. And this shattering was to find its sharpest expression in the Soviet Union because it was based so directly upon a nationalist program. Fearing that the mounting economic problems in the USSR that its policies were producing could produce an economic crisis and lead the bureaucracy to being swept away by an upsurge of the working class, the apparatus launched a preemptive strike from above, moving to transform itself from a bureaucratic caste to a capitalist property-owning class. Basing itself on Trotsky's analysis in 1936 in his book The Revolution Betrayed, in which he explained if the bureaucracy were not, and this is, mind you, 55 years before the events took place, he explained if the bureaucracy were not overthrown by the working class, it would carry out the restoration of capitalism. The ICFI warned that Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika had that exact aim. The forces of Pabloism, however, hailed the Soviet leader for introducing democracy, even leading a political revolution. One of their leading representatives, Ernest Mandel, declared that the prospect of capitalist restoration was simply ridiculous. The Soviet working class, for its part, despite the eruption of social struggles, was unable to defeat capitalist restoration, above all due to the damage done to its consciousness by decades of lies and falsifications by the Stalinist apparatus. Moreover, it had no revolutionary party because in the previous period, forces that had come forward towards Trotskyism within Eastern Europe were deflected by the Pabloid conception that the bureaucratic apparatus was capable of self-reform. Now, the liquidation of the USSR, as those of you might recall, was seized upon by the bourgeoisie and its defenders as the end of socialism, the death of Marxism. This was false on two counts. First, what existed in the Soviet Union was not socialism. It was Stalinism. It was a bureaucracy. And second, the ideology of Stalinism, socialism in one country, was the antithesis of genuine Marxism. The bourgeoisie even maintained that the liquidation of the USSR was the end of history, not in the sense that nothing would ever happen again, but in the sense that the existential struggle between capitalism and socialism was over. But behind the triumphal proclamations, a new agenda was brought forward. US imperialism saw the liquidation of the USSR as an historic opportunity to deal with its own growing economic crisis, signalled by the October 1987 stock market crash, still the largest one-day fall in history. From its rise to a position of the dominant imperialist power in World War I, the US suffered the misfortune to immediately confront its nemesis in the form of the October Revolution of 1917. But now it believed the liquidation of the USSR had created a so-called unipolar moment in which it would finally be able to realise its ambition to dominate the Eurasian landmass and get back those areas, Russia and China, from which it had been excluded by the revolutions of 1917 and 1949. Now, the wars which have followed over the past 3 decades and which have now led us to the brink of a nuclear catastrophe today, from the first Gulf War right through to today, are the outcome of this elemental drive. Now, the reaction to the liquidation of the Soviet Union revealed the fundamental class division between the ICFI and all those tendencies which we now describe as the pseudo-left, which had claimed, however tenuous, some connection with Trotskyism. Our movement recognised the liquidation of the USSR, the state brought into being by the October Revolution, was a defeat for the Soviet and international working class. But it also understood that the deepening contradiction between world economy and the outmoded nation-state system, of which that liquidation was in the final analysis and expression, would create a crisis of capitalism and the possibility of socialist revolution. A new period had opened up in which, for all its difficulties and problems, it would be possible for Marxism, for Trotskyism, to cut for itself a path to the consciousness of the working class, enabling it to free itself of the grip of the parties and organisations that had subordinated it to capitalism. After all, the biggest labour bureaucracy in the world that had been such a crucial prop for imperialism had disintegrated, and correspondingly, the labour bureaucracies and parties that dominated over the working class were in decay. Likewise, various bourgeois national movements in the oppressed countries, which depended on the USSR as they tried to balance between imperialism on the one hand and the working class on the other, would go the same way. That was our analysis. The reaction of the pseudo-left to the liquidation of the USSR was of a completely opposite character. They wept and wailed about midnight in the century, an acceptance of the triumphalism of the bourgeoisie. All was lost. And this reaction laid bare, really, the dirty secret of Pavlovism. Its modus operandi depended on the continued suppression of the working class by the bureaucratic apparatuses, above all Stalinism. Unable to maintain the previous, you could say, balancing act of having a verbal connection to Trotskyism, uttering phrases while subordinating the working class to the dominant labour bureaucracies, unable to maintain that, these organisations moved directly into the imperialist camp. This began with the severing of any remaining verbal connections with Trotskyism. It was summed up by the French Pavlovite organisation, the LCR, as it liquidated itself into the so-called new anti-capitalist party, the NPA. Declaring that the history of the Trotskyist movement had to be junked, it said the NPA did not only not consider itself to be Trotskyist, Trotskyism was just one of the contributors, among others, to the revolutionary movement. It had no position on what the Soviet Union, Stalinism was, etc., etc. And the method enunciated by the NPA, junk history, was the preparation for the formation of the most reactionary alliances. In this country, the main Pabloid organisation, the DSP, now Socialist Alliance, was an early starter in this process, launching in the late 1980s an attack on Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, the basis of his struggle against Stalinism. Now, a critical turning point in the evolution of the pseudo-left, their transformation into open agencies of imperialism, came in 2011 with the Egyptian revolution. At the end of 2000, and it's a lesson that we have to grasp today, of how fast things can change. At the end of 2010, the discussion in left petty bourgeois circles in Cairo centred on the absolute impossibility of removing the Mubarak dictatorship. But in early 2011, all the contradictions that had been building up underneath the surface of the seeming stability of the regime exploded in a powerful general strike by the Egyptian working class, which brought down Mubarak. There is no question that a revolutionary situation had developed, but the working class did not come to power because the crucial and vital link in the chain was missing, a revolutionary party. The role of the pseudo-left organisation in Egypt, the Revolutionary Socialists as they were called, was significant. They first advanced illusions in the progressive role of sections of the army, then in the Muslim Brotherhood, then again in the army, which removed Muslim Brotherhood leader Morsi from the presidency and installed al-Sisi as dictator. Now, while it was betrayed, the Egyptian revolution revealed the enormous power of the working class, and it resonated internationally. With the advancement, for example, of slogans in the US at the time, 2011, as "walk like an Egyptian," "down with the pharaohs." This was in the United States, and it rang alarm bells in Washington. The response was to initiate regime change operations in Syria and Libya. And these were supported by the pseudo-left around the world. In Syria, it was claimed that the US was aiding a so-called Syrian revolution, a movement of extreme right-wing Islamist organisations directed against President Bashar al-Assad. In Libya, imperialism and NATO were supposedly carrying out a humanitarian operation aimed at preventing a bloodbath by President Gaddafi. Now, there are countless statements that one can find from various pseudo-left organisations. And let me just cite one of the most significant that was widely circulated in pseudo-left circles around the world. This was the article by leading member of Socialist Alternative in Australia, Corey Oakley, written in 2012, entitled "The Left, Imperialism and the Syrian Revolution." He declared that what he called knee-jerk anti-imperialism was a thing of the past, and likewise that any emphasis on the imperialist threat to Syria was profoundly mistaken. And in words that should be emblazoned on his forehead, he declared, "Imperialism in the sense of Western neo-colonialism is not the main threat facing the masses of Syria or the Arab world as a whole." He should be sent to Gaza to tell that to the Palestinians. The US operation in Libya was a success when Gaddafi was brutally murdered, to which Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, responded with the ghoulish comment, "We came, we saw, he died." But it was a different matter in Syria. The regime change operation failed because the Assad regime had support from Russia, which wanted to protect its interests in the region. Therefore, the conclusion was drawn by the US that this had to change. it was necessary to remove Russia, the Russian obstacle to its plans, and not just for domination in the Middle East, but for the entire Eurasian landmass. Moves to destabilise the Putin regime were stepped up, including the expansion eastwards of NATO. In 2014, there was a major escalation in these operations with the Maidan coup in Ukraine, which removed the Russian leading president. According to the admissions of leading State Department official Victoria Nuland, it was financed by the US, the Maidan operation, to the tune of $5 billion. The fist was provided by the mobilisation of fascist forces in the Ukraine. But the pseudo-lefts claimed the Maidan operation was a mass revolt for democracy. In 2015, pseudo-left groups around the world hailed the coming to power of Syriza, the coalition of the radical left in Greece, as a step forward for the working class. From day one, Syriza worked to impose the brutal austerity agenda demanded by international finance capital on the Greek working class, culminating in its repudiation of the massive no vote in the July 2015 referendum on the austerity program. Greek workers, peasants, petty bourgeois elements, mass of the population said no to austerity. The government simply tore up the vote and proceeded. In 2022, when the Putin regime, in a reactionary response to the imperialist provocations, invaded Ukraine, the pseudo-left were among the most vociferous supporters of the big lie that this war, which the imperialist powers had been working to instigate, was in defence of the democratic rights of the Ukrainian people. I mean, the war could have been prevented. All that had to be done was an agreement signed: Ukraine will not join NATO. That couldn't be done. Now, this is only a partial glimpse of the pro-imperialist history and program of the pseudo-lefts, which they bring into the anti-Gaza, genocide, anti-war movement. We could cite their role also in the incarceration of Julian Assange, the publisher who has done the most of any single individual to expose US war crimes, when they insisted he go to Sweden, from where he could be quickly extradited to the United States to answer bogus sex charges. The perspective that protest against the imperialist governments, including the Albanese government, can be shifted by mass pressures when clearly they cannot, is not only aimed at sowing confusion and demoralisation. It provides direct support for imperialism, which requires, above all, that the working class is politically straitjacketed. Amid the global eruption of violence, the pseudo-left would have one believe that Ukraine is the good war, while imperialism is somehow defending the rights of the people, as opposed to the bad war in Gaza. There's no such separation. They're pursuing the same objective on both fronts. They're part of a whole, and that includes the ever-expanding military economic operations against China, in which the carve-up of Russia is seen as the necessary first step. And the pseudo-lefts have signalled very early they're on hand, ready to provide support, whatever necessary, by labelling China and Russia as imperialist, thereby giving grist to the mill of the US rampage. Well, I guess a good number of you, came to this lecture with a question on your mind. What is the difference between the SEP and the pseudo-left? I hope my lecture, which has necessarily had to deal with some complex issues, has answered that question. In case it hasn't, just let me give you a summary. The pseudo-left, rooted in sections of the upper middle class, supports capitalist imperialism, either directly or indirectly, by seeking to suppress the independent political struggle of the working class, the great social force, the only social force that can end war. The SEP and the IYSSE fight to overthrow capitalist imperialism through the elevation of the political consciousness of the working class in the struggle for a socialist program. That is the key issue. It's necessary to imbue the working class with socialist consciousness, with an understanding of the objective situation and what it must do. Now, we don't present you with illusions and fake analysis. We don't promise quick fixes. There aren't any. This is a difficult and complex task. Why? Because we're fighting for the greatest social transformation in human history. The first necessary steps to the abandonment, the overturning of the whole previous history of class society. Not a small issue, but one that is now absolutely necessary or civilization won't continue. And so, as Trotsky said of the Bolsheviks, as they led the Russian Revolution, we don't walk away from problems and try to cover them over with fine-sounding words and phrases about how pressure is shifting the imperialist governments. Rather, we walk towards the problem, confront it, and seek to resolve it. And we do so with confidence that, notwithstanding the difficulties, our movement has tremendous power because its program is the expression of historical necessity. It will cut for itself a path to the consciousness of the working class if it is fought for. That requires that decisions are made, and so I urge you now to apply to join the SEP and become a member of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution. Thank you.